So when you talk about how people understand the region, and especially when you think of things like their memory and these kind of culturally inherited memories, I know I had a lot of these things impressed upon me growing up in Mississippi, where things have been historically a little slower to change in a lot of ways. How do you think? I've got my thoughts on this. How do you think um, the South is remembered differently from what actually happened?
I think it's fascinating to me to see because you have all these different threads, right? So you've got cultural and social memory, which is really about what the American public thinks of a certain thing, right? And that's kind of how you see things portrayed through Hollywood or through books or online in some way. And then you've got local identity and memory. And a lot of that is going to be how a community experiences something or what's passed down through oral storytelling or something like that. And then you have what really happened. And I think the South is famous for romanticizing their past. And they've done this from throughout history. It's not just, I think, if you were to ask someone on the street, maybe they would say the Lost Cause, which certainly is a romanticization of the Civil War. However, I think the South has romanticized their entire past, starting from the colonial era. I mean, the reason why the South was founded, Jamestown specifically, they were soldiers. The first boat were soldiers, and they were coming looking for gold. They didn't find it. They thought they were going to find gold, and then they were going home. That's why they didn't know how to farm. And they happened to obviously form a permanent settlement. We kind of know what happens from there. But, I think that in general, people have, especially Southerners, have romanticized that. You have all these different things that have happened. Like Georgia was formed, it's a debtor's colony. Georgia, they emptied out the jails in Britain and they send people to Georgia to settle the land because they need people to occupy and kind of protect the rest of the colonies from being really attacked by the indigenous tribes in Florida. That's why they're there. They're there to absorb kind of and take these debtors don't matter, right? I mean, that's kind of how the English are seeing it, is that they're just going to be there to absorb these indigenous invasions into the colonies. And so I think so you start with this, where this is kind of, if you asked someone today, I don't know if they would know that the South was relatively poor in its founding, right? I mean, the South is a very, in the colonies, it's the poorest region in the founding in the 1700s, 16, 1700s. And then you get into the Lost Cause myth, right? This kind of like transferring of this perception that the Civil War is fought for these just and heroic reasons. It completely downplays the role of slavery, which we know is wrong. But the South has romanticized all of this in a way, I think, as a way to further understand their own identity, in a way to help, I don't want to say soften the blow, but to further understand themselves. A lot of regions do this, but you see it more in the South because of all of the complicated and nuanced things that have happened in this region that have had such an impact on American history. And I do think it's interesting. I mean, you know, there and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Lost Cause. I mean, the reality here is that billions of dollars of the US's economy is tied up in slavery in 1860. Billions of dollars. And the Lost Cause, like this concept that has, this argument that has existed for the past, 150 years, that the Civil War, and I'm going to say the war, and I want to say that, I mean, the Civil War and the South is just the war, right? We all know what I'm talking about. But, this kind of argument that it really was about states' rights and it has nothing to do, they're saving their homeland and the North were the invaders or the aggressors, and none of that is actually true. I think, again, some of that is tied up, this argument is some of this belief, and a lot of people who still live here have ancestors who fought in the war, and it's really, really hard to reconcile the fact that maybe someone in your past or you have family ties to something that was wrong. And so, I think that these conversations about romanticizing and these conversations about the South remembering things differently. And again, everywhere does it, but I think it's more prevalent or more apparent in the South because of its past and how complicated things are.
So, do you basically think that the lost cause is at this point a multi-generational coping mechanism for a lot
Yeah,
of people?
absolutely. I mean, but you still see it. I mean, you still see some of these arguments. You still see this, and we're seeing. I think and I say we, I mean, I think American kind of public historians as a whole, started more of these conversations and this kind of understanding of, well, history is not really up to interpretation. There are some things that can be interpreted, and there's some things that are just known fact, right? The known fact here is that slavery is the cause of the Civil War. States' rights maybe is, I don't want to say maybe, but states' rights is on the list, but it's states' rights to protect slavery. And so I think, some of this, it is a coping mechanism, certainly, but then it's also, some of it is misunderstanding. Some of it, and, again, I think you're seeing some of this kind of repealing and rolling back of Americans' understandings of slavery. I think we as a public were just starting to have open conversations about how horrific and abhorrent slavery was and really understanding that. And now in the past probably 10, 15 years, you've seen some of that slowly started to roll back. We're seeing some changes being made in the public history space, or maybe we're not talking about it as much, or trying to change some of the realities, which really, public history, that's not their job. Public history's role is to put information out there, and it's up to the person who is there to interpret what those facts are.
How have you seen education around Southern history evolve? I'll reverse preface that by saying I found myself in a high school Mississippi history class 122 years after the Civil War ended. We were taught that the two bad guys they were called carpetbaggers and
Scalawags, yeah.
Right. And that was being advanced.
Yeah.
I like to think just a short time ago. Have we advanced past that at least? Because that was obviously through a lost cause lens and centering, where you would be, and I can't even believe we're in a room producing this, and I've got people 10, 20 years younger than me. And I'm curious, have we kind of moved past that in public education? Are there still remnants of that?
There are certainly remnants of that, and I think it depends on where you are. So it depends on what school system you're in. It depends on what state you're in. I was taught those terms when I was in school too, and I'm younger than you are. I mean, I'm a millennial, and so those were terms that we did talk about when I was in high school. Now, when I was in college, those terms changed, and when I was in grad school, those terms changed again. And I think that, in general, kind of what this misconception that's being taught in schools is somewhat, it's really hard to understand the nuance and complications in Southern history in particular. And a lot of those nuances have to do with race. A lot of those nuances have to do with the pain of the Civil War. I think, schools tend to teach something very simple and easy, right? You need to know that Thomas Jefferson and George Washington were the heroes. Americans are the heroes of the day. We went up against the strongest country in the world and we won. But the reality is that with the American Revolution, no one really knows how we won. We know that we won, and we know some factors of how we won, but we weren't really supposed to, right? If you read it, if you look at it on paper, how did we? We're kind of this ragtag bunch of colonists who go up literally against the strongest military in the entire world, and we just somehow beat them. And then we create really what's the greatest nation in the world. I mean, we have more freedoms than anywhere else in the world. We're one of the richest countries in the world. We have more stuff then, and I mean, you look at all the choices, right? You go to the grocery store, you go to Walmart, you go to Target, and you can decide from 50 different shampoos. I've never been anywhere else in my travels where you can do that. And I, talk to people who are visiting here, and they say the same thing. It's almost overwhelming, all of the choices that we have. Yet there's so much darkness in our past, and it's really hard to understand. And it's really hard to, if it's really hard to teach that. And so I think it's easier almost. And again, you still see all this, but it depends on your teacher, it depends on your school system, it depends on your state, it depends on what you're reading in school, and it depends on what you're doing outside of the classroom. But it's really easy to say this group is bad and this group is good. And we've been doing this throughout American history in education. The way that history actually works is just not that's not it. That's not how history unfolds, and it's still evolving, and it's again so complicated. It's almost harder for a 16-year-old, a 15-year-old, a 10-year-old to understand all these nuances and kind of fraught complications. Like, for example, I think often of, the when I was in graduate school at VCU, I took an African American history class. It was, Black history and the long 19th century, and we talked about like the richest person in New Orleans in the antebellum era was a Black woman. She was a woman of color. She owned slaves, and she was, I mean, think of New Orleans at that time. It's a rich city, right? It's a port city. You've got all this stuff coming in and out. It's a very wealthy area, and she's the richest person there. And I don't think if people would realize that, right? It just adds layers of complication and nuance that if you're talking to a kid, they might not really understand what that means. And I think adults don't understand what that means. It's really hard to understand like what race looks like. You're talking about an area in which, and I might say we, and when I say we, I mean the South. I'm a Southerner, but the South has a very, when people think about race, they think Jim Crow, segregation, white people are here, Black people are here, people of color are here. They think that these are these categories, and the reality is that there's not. There is, but there's not. There's a lot of kind of this weird bleeding in of all of these different hierarchies that's really hard to explain and understand if you're not from here.